Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Dam Busters, the podcast that explores the rich, intricate and often controversial history of RAF Bomber Command with me, James Jeffries, and as ever I am joined by my co-host Jane Gulliford-Lowes, where we highlight that the role of the RAF Bomber Command was more than just about dams and Avro Lancasters. RAF Bomber Command's aircraft were initially large and cumbersome biplane aircraft such as a Handy Page Hayfords when it formed in 1936, but by 1968 when the command merged with Fighter Command to form a Strike Command, it was armed with delta-wing nuclear bomb-carrying V-weapons such as the Vulcan, Valiant and Victor. Between that period of just 32 years, this pod will be uncovering and examining beyond the popular narratives and myths to take a deeper dive into the command's captivating and fascinating history. With the primary focus on the Second World War, in which Bomber Command is most synonymously associated with, expect lots of chat about lesser touted aircraft such as the Bristol Blenheim, Handy Page Halifax and Short Stirling, as well as lesser known operations and campaigns. In each episode, we'll dive into intricate, thought-provoking and often emotional tales. We'll also discuss the controversies and take deeper dives into them, from the commanders and crews who shaped the war from above to how technology changed over the course of Bomber Command's existence, as well as the legacy that was left behind, and indeed one that still raises heated debate as well as misunderstanding, which will all be addressed in the podcast. We also talk about the people of RAF Bomber Command and those linked to it, from commanders such as Arthur Bomber Harris to ground crews, as well as family stories. This pod will navigate through the fascinating and often highly moving topic of Bomber Command. So Jane, how have you been?
I'm fine. I'm just in awe of that extremely long, detailed introduction. It was like a PhD, that one.
Yeah, you can tell I've been writing.
Yeah. Well,
I was working on that. I didn't, yeah.
Excelled yourself there, mate. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm all right. Just working, and nothing very exciting happened since we last recorded. So, yeah, just same old.
Yeah. I've been working on the Cambridge stuff mainly, which has taken up a fair amount of time, and I've got lots of trips planned with them, Bletchley Park, Duxford and such like. I've also finished Overy's book, Reign of Ruin, which is absolutely fascinating and very, very thought-provoking, as you would expect from Overy. And I started rereading after about 10 years, Max Hastings' book, Bomber Command, which, yeah, it's interesting. There's some sections which are very, very well written, interesting and such like, but some that you can tell it was written in 1979, and it's there's been a lot that's happened, and there's some questions. Yeah,
he is a beautiful writer, I have to say. I'm reading Vietnam at the minute, and it's absolutely fantastic. So I felt as if I needed to delve into that conflict, as if there's not enough destruction and misery, in my life as it is. But it's very well written. It's very good.
Yeah. But anyway, today we have a guest that I'm sure many of our listeners will know. But can you please introduce him to him, just Jane?
I'd be delighted to. Today, we are joined by Paul Woodadge, who many of you will know from his YouTube channel, WW2TV, which both myself and James have appeared on a number of times. Paul, like James, was born in Colchester in Essex in the UK. Growing up near a former USAAF force base in Suffolk, just across the border from Essex and Colchester, Paul, whom you will all know as Woody, developed a fascination for history and the Second World War in particular. Paul now lives in Normandy in France and is a battlefield guide, historical advisor and consultant on numerous projects. He is an author, including the book Angels of Mercy, which relates the history of the village of Angoville-au-Plain during the Second World War. He's appeared on numerous other productions, including Walking the Ground with James Holland and Al Murray, History Rage and History Hack. He was also an extra, I didn't know this, in some pretty incredible productions, including Enigma, 2001, Saving Private Ryan, 1998, and Memphis Belle, one of my all-time faves, in 1990.
Same.
We are very excited to have you to join us today, Woody. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, no, happy to be here. No, really happy.
Okay. So the first question is relating to World War II TV, which I think is a wonderful source of information on the war and includes talks from historians from all over the world. And one thing that I was very grateful of as a student, it seems like ages ago now, that first talk, is that, at that time I'd only given one or two public talks and it gave me a chance to go on a wider platform and make connections from it. And I still watch it now. I comment every now and again and such, like really, really enjoy it. And I know that we ran a panel talking about the dams raid and its question over whether it was a national obsession. And this question essentially feeds off of that discussion that we had. That was with Dan Ellin and Phil Blood, wasn't it? But do you feel that there are recurrent conversations or themes about the air war that keep repeating or get asked by your viewers?
I mean, yeah, I think the themes that come up are that it has to be thematic, because otherwise, how would you explain the history of Bomber Command? Because you can't really do it raid by raid, because it would end up becoming, to some extent, repetitive. Whereas if you're talking about the ground war and you're looking at, I don't know, the Battle of Monte Cassino, you can look at the New Zealanders on one particular date, and you can look at the Gurkhas further north, and there'd always be something different, because there'd be the different qualities of leadership, the different qualities of the terrain. But terrain doesn't sort of come in when you're in the air war to some extent. The weather does. The leadership is maybe more abstract. So you have to look at the themes of things like, like when we discussed the dam busters, how does it sit in collective memory? Or you look at the concepts of whether or not the strategic air campaign got the results it was intended to get, that kind of thing. So I think those are the questions that end up being asked. Otherwise, it just becomes sort of a listing of a campaign diary. So, from my point of view, the questions about what did it do are much more prevalent with the air war than they are with the ground war, where it's more about what was the result immediately. How did that change the situation on the battlefield at the end of that battle? Whereas there are perhaps broader, long-term questions with Bomber Command and the bombing war.
Yeah.
So how do you approach the topic of the bombing war as a host? I guess there's obviously you need to bring viewers into the conversation, but also wanted to take a deeper dive into the lesser discussed topics and get viewers interested in topics besides the dams raids and Dresden, which is all anyone ever talks about in the popular histories, if you like. How do you sort of spread your net, if you like, and bring in other topics and in a way that sort of illuminates and educates and informs and increases people's curiosity in the subject as a whole?
I mean, for me, it's about finding the guest first more than it is finding the subject. So who is this person and what are they trying to say about this subject, as opposed to, I don't necessarily think I ought to do something on Dresden, although that is one of the topics I've had on a list since I started, and for whatever reason, not quite got to it yet. And I don't know quite why I haven't got to it yet. So it's more who is this person? How have I come across this person? What are they trying to say about that? And therefore, is there something that we can discuss? So I'm thinking, for example, Tony Redding was on a few years ago talking about the raid on Forsheim. And it was more that he had something to say about that raid contextually, more than, I definitely didn't sit there and think, I need to do a show about Forsheim. I don't think I necessarily heard of Forsheim until he came across my radar. And it was because he'd done a show on the Chindits on my channel first. And then he suggested his other book. I was like, that sounds really good. And it was because the Chindits conversation with him had been so kind of wide-ranging that then I thought, okay, so he's the ideal person to then discuss this other subject because he's got something to say. And I think that's where I come at it from. What is the person trying to say? Which is you use Dan Ellin, I use Dan Ellin, because Dan always has something to say about the subject beyond just, here's a list of aircraft, here's the time they took off at, here's where they went, here's how many came back, which is important. We have to have that basic framework to build on, but there needs to be some point to the conversation, I think.
Yeah, I think I've realised that when I've given talks. I know I gave one on Operation Oyster for World War II TV, and I did do that. I said, these aircraft took off, they did this, these were the bomb results, etc. But for me as a host, and it's probably because of my own research, I do find it more interesting to discuss, okay, what were the consequences of that? Yeah. How is it remembered, etc., etc. I guess it's a sort of similar thing, isn't it, really?
Yeah, and personalities as well. Is there someone in this story who is worth discussing because of whatever quality they had? I've done shows on New Zealand pilots and Australian pilots and quite a few on American bomb crews, for example. So it's that, is there a human interest story as well? Because I think the World War II TV audience, I mean, I've never had an email request saying, Woody, do more strategic bombing. I've never had one of them. If I have, I've forgotten. But if I do a show about a Bomber Command story that has a good human interest story, someone will say, that was good, you should do more shows like that. But are they saying it because it's got the human interest angle that happens to be Bomber Command bit based, or is it because it is Bomber Command or RAF base. And I'm not really sure. Yeah, I can tell you, I get multiple requests all the time for Battle of Britain content. So
I bet.
that tells
Counts
us
the
it tells
praise.
us something we already know, but it does tell us something.
Yeah, definitely. So other than myself and Jane, of course, what other guests discussing the air war have proven interesting to listen to? And I guess we're kind of already answering, so why might they have been interesting?
Well, I mean, obviously you two have to say that goes without saying. It's in the contract I had to sign to be on here.
Thank you.
Dan, of course, I mentioned Tony Redding. I mean, Dr. Stephen Bourquet, the American historian, I think probably still gave me the most I've ever thought about the results of bombing with regards to Normandy and D-Day, which is, of course, my backyard. Luke Truxell talks a lot about the American air power, but he also brings in the Allied. And, this is something, a tangent I can go down, is that I don't, unlike yourselves who are sticking with that Bomber Command story, I don't necessarily want to kind of get into that thing where I'm separating Bomber Command from 8th Air Force or 15th Air Force, because it is all part of the same air war. So, I people who know me well, like, as much as I understand why we have to have the maps of the 5 D-Day beaches with the American flag above Utah and Omaha, et cetera, I don't like seeing it in that simple way, because Bomber Command are taking on targets in the American sector, the 8th Air Force are taking on targets in what you might call the British and Commonwealth sector. So I think kind of having a nationalistic view isn't necessarily the way I address things. So Stephen Bourquet, although he writes primarily about the Americans, and Luke Truxell talks about the Americans, he always brings the other allies in, and so he's doing some great work. John Curatola, who's a historian at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, he is another one who's able to bring in the concept of strategic bombing, but maybe from the point of view of one of the particular air forces or nationalities, but at the same time widen it out to that, as we were saying earlier, that kind of broader thematic questions about the effectiveness of strategic bombing. And I think if you want to be a successful strategic war historian, you have to accept the learning curve was definitely there, and it didn't ever necessarily in World War II the perfect art. Whereas you could say that some other aspects of World War II, I mean, I don't know, the amphibious assaults, for example, by the time you
just
get
going to say amphibious,
yeah, you can definitely see they weren't very good at it earlier, and at the end of the war, they were much better. But does strategic bombing, I mean, and if it does get that success, it comes with that baggage of the success bringing about the deaths of civilians. Dresden, firebombing of Tokyo, then means success then becomes an anti-success thing because you've killed people, which makes it very complicated, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think as well, there's always a bigger picture, isn't it? Like something I try to force myself to look at it from a bigger picture point of view always. I think there's just this tendency to kind of separate things out into sort of individual battles, campaigns, weapons or whatever. But you just can't. It's just, you have to try and look at the thing as a whole, which I do try to do. But I mean, it is very, very easy to go down into sort of different rabbit holes and what have you, as we all know.
Well, I mean, I think that's where, sorry to interrupt you, Jay, where fundamentally things like podcasts and YouTube and things work well is that there's like a spider's web of learning, in that you, with books, it's like you're in your lane reading a particular book, and until you've finished that book, you have to stick in that lane, be it, the Chindits or the air war in a particular theater. Whereas in this sort of format, you can bounce around a bit more and say, well, it's having this effect elsewhere. And one of my favorite expressions I've kind of copied from another YouTuber, from Indy Nidell from the World War II series, is nothing happens in a vacuum. And that has been, I've used that so often, in that you have to consider that whatever's happening in the Mediterranean to do with the Suez Canal is affecting the logistics of how the Soviets are moving something from something to somewhere else. And then the bombing of this area means that the enemy are putting more resources into this area, which means they're not putting them somewhere else, and all those things. It means you end up having to have lots of plates spinning to kind of keep your brain working. But I think it's what keeps it bubbling and lively, as opposed to just, at its core, history is recording dates and times and places. But in that regard, it's incredibly boring. I mean, it is just a data process. It's the thematic response and understanding the significance is what makes it, theoretically, for all of us here, a compulsion, an obsession, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Well, I think I've said it before. The more that I learn, the more I realise I don't know, and I desperately want to know. So even with the Augsburg at the moment, I'm talking about April 42. You've got the Doolittle raid at the same point. So there is this kind of throwing pots and pans, trying to make use of the bombers and hitting back and such like because of the context of the war so far. And they think about the Channel Dash, what's happening in the Battle of the Atlantic. And I'm suddenly wanting to know even more about that. So I'm jumping all over the place just on one while I'm trying to focus on one topic.
I saw something yesterday, and it was on an IT page where a historian, I forget what the subject they were working on, not World War II, not World War at all, but they had their computer crashed because they left their computer and they had 1,600 windows open. And I think we can all identify with that. Yeah, I don't think I've got that far. I mean, I've had a few dozen open at a time, but that I think we've all got to that. Oh, hang on. Just open that and look up there. Or just open that. And suddenly you're studying the entire history of the world.
Oh, that's insane. So we touched on Normandy earlier, Woody. Having grown up in England and now living in Normandy, how is the air war remembered and memorialised there? And what are the main talking points, do you think?
Well, I mean, the easy way to respond is say it isn't. In the sense that the air war, by the way you worded that, isn't remembered. Now, people think, no, but I've seen monuments. Yes, you have seen monuments, but not to the air war. They are to victims of the air war. The air war really isn't talked about. You get like the replica Typhoon. I always point out it is a replica Typhoon hanging from the ceiling of the museum in Com. It still looks cool, but it's not a real one. So you have monuments to, well, there are monuments to the ALGs. So for the fighter bombers and the fighters, things like that. And then when the bombing war comes in, it is about the honoring of victims. So, for example, on my birthday this year, I was in the town of Rennes, and Rennes had some pretty devastating raids in 1940 and again in 44. And so the monuments are to the French civilian victims. There were also Allied victims in 1940, prisoners of war who were killed on a train. But there would be nothing necessarily on that monument about these. This is a force of bombers that took off from this airfield here. They were comprised of members of these squadrons, because that's not how the war is told here. So it's interesting, and I'm not really sure why the air war isn't talked about in that way. But I suppose part of it is because it's hard to relate to, whereas a viewing platform in the Falaise Gap can point to where the Poles are, the Canadians, the British, the Germans, and you can kind of look around and go, oh, that's the hill where the Poles were. But an air war battle would just be an arrow pointing upwards, wouldn't it? It's so it's up there. They're up there in the sky is where the air war was taking place. So because when you invited me to this and I gave it some thought, and the RAF monuments I can think of, except the ones to the ALGs, are to crashed bombers.
Yeah.
So it's the transference of interest goes to from what the bomber was in the sky for in the first place to the fact it crashed in the village and these people died in the village. In the American sector, when I'm going to Orgland, which is and Nehu is where Patton's Third Army camp is. I go through a village. I can't even remember what it's called. It's one of those typical Norman like 7 houses villages, and there's a monument to a crashed Wellington. I think in 42, it might have been 43. And I assume it's there because it's the only thing that happened in that village at all, beyond armies passing through.
With regard to the civilian memorials that you've just been talking about, and that there were a huge number of civilian casualties, obviously, in France as a result of Allied bombing, is there any sort of discussion around what the bombing was actually for, what the purpose was, or is it the focus just sort of entirely on the other victims, do you think?
I think it's mostly on the victims. I think it's because it's a hard subject for the French to kind of take on board, is the fact that the bombing they were the victims of the bombing that was there to save them. Then this paradoxical thing, and Dr. Stephen Bourquet, who I talked about earlier, I mean, the big point he makes in his book, Beyond the Beach, that I'm holding, I know we're not doing video, but I like the fact the subtitle is The Allied War Against France. because he specifically points out that from a certain point of view, the bombs are anti-French, even though the French are the country who the Allies are trying to liberate, and they are, by this point, the separation, the divide. France is now fully occupied by the Germans. So it's this transference of the concept, because the plan, as you know, as the both of you know, the big 1930s proponents of strategic air war and how it would be the bomber would always get through and we won't need to have ground wars, all that kind of stuff. That plan didn't really envisage the dropping of bombs on a friendly nation that has been occupied by an enemy nation. The idea was you would be dropping bombs directly on the country that you are fighting the war against, which obviously a lot of what Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force, etc., are doing is against Germany itself. But in the 30s, they weren't thinking that, there'd be incredible amount of bombing of France. And you add up the entire total of the number of French killed by bombs in World War II by the Allied bombs. It's no one knows exactly how many, which is a huge number.
Yeah.
And on D-Day alone, we're talking, 1,200 deaths 1,300 deaths in Calvados, the department I live in. 8,000 from June, July, and August in Normandy, 12,000 totally in Normandy. And the transportation plan, I think it's such a weird concept for the French to kind of take on board that they just sort of don't. It's like, let's not just talk about it. Like, and the enemy here really remains the Nazis and the Germans. This is a separate issue, but it's interesting. So in the town of Saint-Lô, which was heavily bombed by the Brits and Americans, everybody else over weeks, there's a church with an artillery shell that's still embedded in the wall, right? And in kind of popular memory, it's referred to as the German bomb, the German shell, right, in the town. But it's come from the Allies. You only have to look at a compass. It's an American artillery shell embedded in the wall of the church that didn't detonate. So it's fired by the Americans, clearly. I mean, it absolutely was. In collective memory, it has become the Germans that fired it, even though they know it wasn't, because that's the way they can rationalize it.
Yeah. I'm just looking at a map, which I've got above my desk, which shows pinpoints all the raids that my uncle and his crew took part in. And I'm just totaling up all the French ones, and there's 4 against targets in France. There's Le Mans, Le Creuset, Montbéliard, Montluçon. Yeah.
Montluçon, yeah.
I hadn't realised there was that many actually, but just
Montluçon is the one of the. Sorry,
that's like between 43 and early 44. So before the sort of the big bombardments of the Normandy campaign. Yeah.
Montluçon was one of the homes of the Vichy. It's another spa town like Vichy, just north, and so it was a big Vichy centre. So that was in 43. Nice town now. Would be baking hot today, but yeah. No, it's memorialization and how things are remembered is something I just love to get into, because even in the 20 years I've been here, I see it changing and evolving all the time, and I find it fascinating. So there's just been unveiled on June the 5th this year a monument to the 8th Air Force with 4 figures, including General Doolittle, and it went up at Lafayette in the 8th Airborne sector near Saint-Mary-Église, and already people are saying, but that's not really where the 8th Air Force did anything, I think. And what we're hearing is that the towns that were actually hit by the 8th Air Force or Bomber Command are or had been a little bit uncertain about whether they wanted to have a monument to individuals within an organization that dropped bombs on them, even for the liberation of their country. So I'm not sure we're going to see any mass rush to get big statues up to the to Bomber Command here in Normandy or elsewhere in France, because it's like a weird thing to think about. And yet, I say, if a bomber went down, there'll be a monument to that, because that becomes the monument intention gets transferred to the victims of the guys inside the aircraft.
I mean, I guess we're kind of already answering this question, but I guess we could change it a little bit, is how the bombing was felt within the summer of 1944 itself. But I'm also interested in you mentioned that it's changed, and that's something that I find especially interesting in this concept of collective memory. What would you say has changed?
It's hard to pin down. I mean, definitely at the time, there was some bitterness from the French, understandably, about just how many people had to die, particularly in the transportation plan. And then I think for a long time it was just sort of forgotten about because people didn't want to think about the fact that how much death that had brought there. I think in simple terms, the whole effects of the bombing, the heavy bomber campaign in Normandy is that it missed. I think if you ask most people here, so what? Tell us about the effect of heavy bombers in Normandy. They would cite missing the beaches on D-Day, and they would then mention the friendly fire casualties at the beginning of Operation Cobra and the civilian loss of life in the cities of Caen, those things like that. So, but French historians probably started tackling this as a subject before Allied, West English-speaking historians, because I think the Western historians or the English-speaking historians were focusing on Germany and Dresden and those sorts of things. Where obviously, if you were teaching history in Caen, then your first, open your window, you would see buildings that were rebuilt because of the bombing in 1944. So French historians, Jean Killian, people like that, did a lot of work on the effectiveness of the transportation plan, the effectiveness of the bombing, and started raising questions that did it really delay the Germans' response to Normandy as much as we think it did? Although then that touched on the fact that because the French have had an odd relationship with their own occupation in the post-war narrative, everybody was in the resistance, then became that nobody was in the resistance, and now it's like some people were in the resistance. But more recently, these studies have shown that as much of the German delays in getting to Normandy for the Armour Division was caused by the French disruption on the ground, mucking up signal boxes, harassing of the units moving on the roads, blowing up bridges, those kind of little small-scale, disruptive, annoying things, as much as the big raids by the heavy bombers on a marshalling yard that we now know the Germans were pretty good at repairing the damage to that, not quite immediately, but very quickly. So it's changing all the time, the attitude to the air war. But I think most people just don't want to think about it. And Stephen Bourquet, his point is because it didn't work, is that more of it didn't work than did work. So Normandy, the way people look back on Normandy is the liberation. They look back on the coming back of freedom and hope. And so the flags will come out in June for that message of peace coming back, and kind of getting sidetracked by the fact the bombing war wasn't maybe quite as effective as it could have been. I think people just don't want to go down that path.
Yeah. That, I guess, takes it nicely onto the next point. I think it's the main difference between the British and French experiences and therefore memories of the war is that one country was occupied and the other wasn't. But as a general point, how would you say that the memories and memorialisation, remembrance of the war in general, not just the air war, differ between France and the UK?
Well, I think very simply it's because France doesn't have that romanticism of the war. It doesn't have that. I'm not saying that I'm not one of these people. I'm the sort of person who can get excited by seeing Spitfires flying over. And I am a little bit excited by that whole boy zone attitude of World War II. But I also, balancing that, have that, but there's a hell of a lot of suffering attitude. But I think in France, you just can't really have sized idea of World War II. That there is, France doesn't have that middle-aged man who buys model kits and reads lots of books and has Spitfires hanging from his. I'm sure they do, but they don't have it in the insane numbers that the UK and the USA. And I say that's my audience. I'm not knocking. Those people are fantastic. That is us.
That is. I'm just pointing listeners to a model Lancaster that's just behind me.
You're not middle-aged,
you don't
Jim.
really get that in France.
A few more years.
Yeah.
Well, I'm more than middle-aged, but I think that's the fundamental difference, is that there isn't that. That you can't in France close your brain off to the suffering. Whereas if you are in Britain or the USA or Canada and you want to just think about the cool looking tanks and how cool aircraft are and look at the elliptical wing of the Spitfire and all that, you can do that without having daily reminders of the sad side. But in France, you have daily reminders of the sad side, because every church has a monument, every village has a monument. You drive past cemeteries everywhere. You drive, and that's on a daily basis. So you drive down a street called, General de Gaulle Street, or Paris, the City of Lights. But you go to Le Marais, my favorite part of Paris, where the lovely falafel cafes and restaurants and things, but they're, above your head all the time are the plaques to the Jewish families deported and murdered. So you can't escape the reality of that in France. Now, France did have a bit of an issue dealing with its collaboration and Vichy and Pétain, but they've almost come out of that much healthier side, like the Americans and their kind of post-Vietnam thing, where they kind of come through that now. Now the France, I'm not saying that they're happy to talk about the collaboration, but they're open about it. I could go and switch French TV on right now and there'd be a documentary about what an arsehole Pétain is. Whereas 20 years ago, there was a lot of like, but no resistance, de Gaulle, So I think that the main difference is that it's rooted in an understanding that people died and they died in their tens of thousands. And I think although people in Britain are aware of that, you can put that to one side of your brain if you want to.
Yeah.
I'm kind of thinking that in the context of how the war is considered and dealt with in Norway as well. And there's lots of similar themes there. Obviously, that there wasn't the huge loss. There was significant loss of life, but not the huge loss of life that there was in France. But there's that kind of like struggle to come to terms with the occupation and people's role in it. And I was talking to someone about this the other day, and we like to romanticize the whole resistance thing. Lots of people were involved in the resistance. Lots of people weren't. But I think the experience for the vast majority of people was basically just getting your head down and just trying to get on with your life as best you could in the circumstances, And I think I suspect that perhaps plays into the French experience as well for many, many people.
I think so. And I think where you hit it there exactly is that in the UK and in USA, there can be a very binary approach. The Allies are the good guys, the Nazis are the bad guys, or the Japanese are the bad guys. And that's obviously how it mostly was. But how many people, I don't know, in London in 1942 really understood that the victory was coming? How many of them are losing faith? I mean, I did a fantastic show on my channel last week with Miles Bingham about his mother's Blitz diary. She was a teenager in the war, and how despondent they were in 1944 and quite bitter and angry what they were that V1s and V2s were landing and exploding. And this is the reminder to all of ourselves, is that we now know that the war did come to an end, but at any point during it, the next outcome is not known. And so people were not as confident in the UK. The Blitz spirit didn't keep alive in everybody's hearts, so to speak, for 5 years. People had whole years and where they were just despondent and not hopeful. And France, as you said, Jane, people just had to get on with it and kind of hope for better times and kind of bend with the breeze and just accept that this is the world you're living in right now. And I always come back to Dr. Chris Millington in Liverpool when he talks about resistance and collaboration are too loaded as concepts. He prefers accommodation and defiance, or defiance and accommodation. So the resistance isn't necessarily just going up and blowing up trains. It's being actively, defiant. It's, listening to radios you're not supposed to listen to, making it difficult for the Germans to check your passes and slow them down and be a bit of an arsehole when it comes to giving them lower quality. If you're being forced to give them grain from your farm, you try and give them the shittiest grain, or what, just to try and be, you do what you're being told to do, but you try and keep your spirits up by resisting. And collaboration is in our heads, is that, people like in Norway, Jay, with a pitchfork taking down an Allied pilot to the Gestapo in Oslo to get money for that reward. That's proper collaboration. But doing what the occupiers say to you, if you're a Norwegian fisherman saying, you must fish between these times and this times, and if you follow those rules, are you a collaborator? Or are you just, are you finding the best solution to the situation you're in?
For these people, this is the new normal, isn't it? They don't know that this is going to end. This could be their lives forever now. So many of them expect that it will be. So, to kind of, I think, criticize them retrospectively for just getting on with their lives and trying to make the best of their situations, I think it's very, very harsh with the benefit of hindsight. But it's such a difficult conversation to have, isn't it?
Yeah. And we're kidding ourselves if that we as Brits would somehow be any different
exactly
to the Belgians, the Norwegians, the French, everybody else who had that situation. I mean, the channel and all that it created in terms of a hurdle for the Germans is as much what saved us as anything else. Yes, we have an air defense plan, and yes, we have a navy, but it was a channel that was the big hurdle that stopped Hitler just crashing straight into us in 1940 like everybody else. And this idea that we have, and we're kind of getting into politics of kind of Brexit, but this idea that Britain are somehow special and that we were alone and we're better than everybody else is, as we all know, is just complete bullshit.
Bollocks,
So, we're lucky as Brits to be able to have that binary way of looking at it. And we all like to think that if we were a prisoner of war, we would be Steve McQueen, where the reality is we might not be. We might be the guy who just gets on with it and writes letters home and doesn't try to escape. Yeah. And if we were being bombed on in 1940, would we feel that the Blitz spirit was with us every day? I don't think we would. I think we'd end up getting a bit bitter. And, how many people dared whisper in 1940? Maybe Chamberlain was right. Maybe Lord Halifax was right. Because that's essentially what the French did with Pétain. They're like, well, maybe he's right. Yeah. We now know he was wrong.
Yeah.
But that was put to the test. But we British, we have a way of looking back at the past that makes us look really good and everybody else look really crap. And I think we're not always honest.
But yeah, and I think that's something as historians, not that there's rules to being a historian, but you've got to be aware of what is happening and what is viewed at the time, as you rightly said. I really enjoyed your video, it was May now, where you talked about it was an Ask Me Anything about VE Day, and there were a lot of questions about people celebrating and reactions and stuff. And we do have this image of it was partying on the streets and Union flags all over the place and such like. But there were mothers crying in houses that had lost their son. There were people still out on active service that got the news and were busy, doing whatever duties they were doing and such like. But we like this collective kind of like idea of what everyone was doing.
Because it's comfy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And how many people did VE Day just all the keeping it together because the war was going on and now the war's coming to an end? How many people just lost it because they just had that, I don't need to wear that mask. I don't need to keep smiling every day. I can now just go back and be really upset about my son who died in Tobruk or whatever it would be. So which kind of brings us back to the air war in Normandy and how it's remembered. And you're not going to see panels up here saying, and here's where all the bombs landed, and this is what this did. Is this prevented this German division from getting here? And hey, you're just not going to see it from that point of view, because it would be the weird way of looking at it.
Yeah. Well, I really want to ask this next question. I know that we've chatted about your family connection to RAF Bomber Command. So can you tell us a little about William Bunting?
Yes, I'm happy to. So he was my first cousin twice removed. So my paternal grandmother's younger brother, William Frederick Bunting from Ugly in Hertfordshire, was in RAF Bomber Command, and he did the classic, cadet. I've got photos of him with the white band round his hat when he was a cadet, and so on and so forth. And he died on the 29th of July, 1944, on a raid to Stuttgart, and he's buried in the Dernbach cemetery there, Bad Tolls near Bayern. And it was one of those terrible nights for Bomber Command. 7.9% losses. Full moon, German night bombers everywhere. We think it was a night fighter that got him. The pilot actually was a Lancaster. The pilot was thrown clear and was captured, but he was a navigator. Except, and this is where the story gets a bit murky, because I haven't done the research. It's on my long list of things to do, and there's a slightly bitter and twisted story about me and my dad. My dad and me, because we were both World War II buffs, assumed that his cousin, once removed, Marjorie, William's younger sister, would give us in the family the logbooks, the medals and stuff. And when she died, and she didn't, she gave it to Imperial War Museum. His medals are there, his flight log, his logbooks are all there. So I could go there and request to see them, but I'm now here in Normandy, and it's on my list. But he died with 582 Squadron. The family legend is he was a Pathfinder, which I'm not 100% sure he was. I think that's that kind of family way of just building a bit. But he had done a tour of 40 sorties with 150 Squadron. And he was gazetted for the DFM on the 13th of April, 1943, when they were flying out of Blida. I think that's how you say it in Tunisia. And I'm not sure whether that was Wellingtons or Sterlings. They seem to have both at that sort of time. I haven't done the deep dive into 150 Squadron. But we think at that point he was a pilot. And then he does navigator training. And I don't know, I was going to ask you two, how common that would have been. Because I understand in American, they're always short of navigators. So would that be a likely thing to go from pilot to navigator?
I've not come across that. The only circumstances I've come across that in is where someone has, whether it's being like for medical reasons, such as eyesight or something like that, or where perhaps they have suffered from some sort of flying stress or anxiety or something like that, and they're being put into a different role. But other than that, I've not really come across it. But still flying, so it's still going to be stressful.
Well, this is, again, sort of part of the family legend, is that, and I know you can draw a lot from looking at photos, but he does look sensitive. And I knew his brother Jack. So his brother Jack was a gamekeeper up in North, and he'd fought out in North Africa with the artillery. And I still have his folded wooden mirror. He had carved 1943 when he was in Tunisia. I still have that in my living history gear from years and years ago. Anyway, but Jack always said that William was kind of nervous and shy. He was 23 when he died, and kind of introspective. And so there's a bit of a family legend that first tour, and if you do 40 tours and you get a DFM, you're obviously, you can do it. You're pretty good at your job.
Yeah.
And I believe 150 Squadron did get disbanded for a while, then reformed later on as something else. But he ends up in 582 Squadron. But he's definitely a navigator when he dies. But it may be as simple as the fact his rank was pilot officer. And therefore, within the family, there's this idea that he was a pilot.
Possibly, yeah.
Right, that could be
and
it.
Me and my dad did look at his logbook for, like, we were there having dinner, breakfast, tea with Marjorie, and I would have been about 15, something like that. And I don't know I don't know what look I gave my dad, but I definitely gave my dad we'll better look at these properly at some point, because she's clearly going to give these to us. And she didn't. And we thought she'd give them to Hendon, because that's what she said. She gave them to the RAF Museum. It turned out she had given them to the IWM. And we were like, oh, bugger. Because we kind of thought we did everything but actually tell her directly to her face, and you will leave these to us because we will absolutely look after them and honor them. I mean, I've got some photos of him and things like that, but yeah, so they're in the IWM. So I haven't done the deep dive, but what I think is interesting from my point of view is that he would fill into that category that had he crashed in France, he would be the kind of person that would then have a memorial to his crash, as opposed to what he was doing in the first place, which is so in a way, his service encapsulates my interest in Bomber Command. I think that's probably why I haven't talked about Dresden on my channel. Is I don't know how I really feel about it. I don't know that I've got a firm opinion.
Yeah.
I have a fairly firm opinion about Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Mm-hmm.
I'm open to other ideas, and I do question why I believe certain things. I think if anyone's got an absolute clear, yes, Dresden was completely valid point of view, or it was a war crime, I question how you can be so certain.
Absolutely.
My view changes weekly. Yeah, just about. Yeah, on that subject, it really does. But it does about sort of the air war generally. Sometimes I think, oh well, yeah, it was a good thing, it achieved this, that, and the other. And other days I'm thinking, God, what a monumental waste of lives and resources. So yeah, it fluctuates all the time. But I think that is a good thing, because it means that you are open to other perspectives, other views, new information, etc. And I think having that sort of fluidity of opinion is a good thing ultimately.
Yeah. I think that, with my French friends here, and when we go to the pub with, French tour guides and these, the people who have an interest in World War II, they would have the feeling that it's right there are no monuments in Normandy to the RAF. Whereas I'm like, but surely that's part of the understanding of how you cannot take the air war out of the success of the Normandy campaign.
Yeah.
Now, you could argue that it's more kind of fighter bomber based and heavy bomber based, but I would question that. I would say the heavy bombers absolutely have a role in it. If not perfect, it's part of the story. That when you look at the beginning of Operation Cobra, for example, and Cobra is taken, I know we go off on a tangent, is always told from the point of view of the friendly fire casualties of the Americans. But I always go, but look at what it does to the Panzer Lehr Division. The Panzer Lehr Division basically see their tanks bouncing around like ping pong balls in a wind tunnel because whatever it is, 3,200 bombers dropped however many tons of bombs it is in an area 3 miles by 1.25 miles that basically busts a door open for Operation Cobra to crash south. So how can that not make the air war relevant? How can you not talk about the air war if it does something that monumental to kick the door down at the beginning of that operation? But I think the French would think, yeah, but you can't really celebrate the pilots. And I'm like, I'm not asking you to celebrate the pilots. I'm asking you to acknowledge that someone like my first cousin ended up in the RAF and he ended up in the Bomber Command, and his job was to navigate bombers to their targets. He didn't choose what the targets were. He didn't choose that it was civilians there. But why would he be perceived differently by the French in 2025 than a GI running up Omaha Beach or a Tommy running up Broadway? That's the question that sticks in my mind. So my cousin is that the visual representation I have of how I perceive Bomber Command as individuals, separate to how I envisage Bomber Command as an organization and a concept.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
This is deep, isn't it? Wow.
Yeah, love it. Love it. Yeah. This is exactly what we were after. We knew we'd get this with you, would it? It's fantastic. Is there any more questions that you want to ask James before we get to the wrap up? Or we could talk about
millions,
this
but
hours. Yeah,
I've got a few more minutes. I don't mind.
My brain is absolutely bouncing all over the place. But yeah, it is one of those things with the air war. I've read different conclusions to things, and I've gone, yeah, I get both of them. Agreeing is a different thing. I wouldn't say I agree to either or both, but I can see why that conclusion has come to that. And we've had this discussion for exactly 80 years, since the war ended. And I think we're going to continue having it. I don't think there is going to be a definitive answer to a lot of the questions raised and a lot of the topics that are discussed. That's my opinion on it anyway.
And I think that's why your podcast, what I'm doing, is important, because these difficult questions that have no answer, it's like philosophical questions that you just can't answer. What is the meaning to life? I mean, you can answer them. You can put forward a theory, but it's not really a solution. It's like a papering over of a much bigger, wider concept. And I think that's why we need to challenge all of these narratives that are the simple ones are the easiest ones to look at, and I don't know, Market Garden was a bridge too far, for example. Sounds like they went one bridge too far. That sounds like a nice, tied up, neat package of where it went wrong. But of course, it's not that simple. And I think with the strategic bombing war, I think if we're honest to ourselves and we want to take that kind of complicated, nuanced look at it, it will be very rewarding. Even if you can't come up with any firm conclusion, that I don't think we need to come up with firm conclusions. We don't need to say the poll is out. The country has decided Dresden was fine. I don't think we don't need to be in that kind of place. Why we don't need to tie it up like that. Dresden poses a deep question about ourselves and about morality and about humanity, and that's why it's a valuable. I'm not saying its purpose was just to give us something to talk about, but it opens up the path to talking about perceptions at the time, perceptions later, material results compared to psychological results, all those kind of things that are hard to break. I got a bit of flack on my channel, no pun intended, because I said the Doolittle raid was really only a propaganda raid recently. I went, yeah, no, you could see my point though. I said,
that's the way towards it.
It did have some effect, but bringing death to lots of Chinese people being one of them. But why not have these questions? Why a thing doesn't need to be in one category? It can straddle multiple categories.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Perfect.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Woody, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for providing us with a fascinating debate and also sharing the story of William Bunting. And I do hope you get time to research his story properly at some point, because we'd love to hear more about him as well. Sadly, though, that's time to wrap things up. As ever, a huge thank you to all our listeners worldwide for tuning in. And if you're enjoying the show, we'd love it if you could leave us a review or a star rating on your favourite podcast platform. It really helps other like-minded people find us. If you aren't doing so already, but you'd like to help us to continue to produce great content, you can support the show by becoming a subscriber for just £2.40 or $3 a month. Just hit the link in the show notes or visit nevermindthedambusters.buzzsprout.com. Do also come and join the conversation in our Facebook discussion group, and also follow us on social media. Links are in the show notes. Until next time, see you later, and thanks so much for listening, everybody. Thank you. Bye.